What's happening, guys? Welcome back. So we've got part 3 of my IAME KA100 rebuild on deck, and in this one what we're going to do is rebuild the crank. So to rebuild your crank, you're going to need some tools. You're going to need a truing stand. So after you get the crank rebuilt, you'll need to throw it in a truing stand just so you can measure it, make sure that it's all lined up, and if it isn't lined up, you're going to need to get yourself one of these copper hammers so that you can beat on the webs until it is straight. And you may also need a vise to get it trued up as well. Hopefully we don't need the vise, just depending on how true it comes out of the jig after we're done. So we'll get to that a little bit later. So here's the jig I'm going to be using. This is an IAME tool that you can get from IAME, and what you do is you just place your crank webs in here. We'll put this underneath the press, and we'll use this to press the crank back together. And what's nice with this tool, I can do X30s, I can do KAs, I can do minis. I've even done rock VLRs in here as well. So it's a pretty awesome tool. Over here we've got our crank webs. Got everything torn apart, cleaned up, ready to go. I've got my rod. Here's my new bearing. You got to put some new washers in. And then I've got a new crank pin. And you know, sometimes when you order your bearings, they come like this, all separated. So I'm going to show you how I put these back together. I've got a little trick for that, and we'll go over that as well. But that's pretty much it, guys. When you're rebuilding your crank, the only new parts you're going to need to get are the washers, the bearing, and then a new crank pin. You can replace these little guides or whatever these guys are, but that's pretty much it. Other than that, you just get it put back together, make sure it's true, and throw it back in the engine. So the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to get this jig under the press. We'll get the crank pressed back together, and then if we need to use the truing stand, we'll go ahead and we'll true this crank up so it's ready to go. Let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, so real quick on how to put these together. If you do order your bearing and it comes like this, the trick I've found is you just pull out the cage and get yourself some painter's tape, or essentially any kind of tape that doesn't leave residue. We'll just pull a little strip off. And then we'll just put this on the outside of the bearing, or the cage, I'm sorry. Fold yourself off a little tail so you can pull it off nice and easy. And then you just get the rollers and just go ahead and place the rollers in there one by one. And what they'll do is they'll stick to the tape so they don't fall out on you. Once you've got them in there, just visually double check and make sure you didn't leave any gaps. I'm sure if you forgot to put one of these rollers in there and you didn't notice it before you put your crank back together, I'm sure that'd probably be pretty catastrophic once you start running the engine. But simple trick, just get yourself some painter's tape or any kind of tape that doesn't leave residue, and then you can get these things put back together pretty simply. Okay, so the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to get the crank pin pressed into one of the webs. And it doesn't matter which web you use to start with. And you know, I put this little box that I've got just lying around in here to hold this up. Makes it a little easier to work because this thing is extremely heavy. And fortunately, I've yet to drop it and smash my fingers yet. But that's what I'm trying to avoid just by putting that box in there. So we'll go ahead and get one of the crank webs. placed in here. And what I like to do is, obviously here's the hole for our crank pin. So I'll put that in, and then I rotate that hole around so it's right here in the middle of the jig. Just like that. So that's toward the center of the whole jig. Oh, and you know what? I forgot to mention a tool that you'll need. This is also an IAME tool. And what this does is this just sits right in here and it holds the crank pin so that it doesn't flop around while you're pressing it. So just a simple little tube, steel tube, that we'll use to hold the crank pin in place while we're pressing it in. And you only need this tool when you're first pressing it into the first half of the web. So I like to get a little bit of oil, and this is just castor oil. Put a little bit of oil on my finger. Rub that on the inside of the crank. Get a little bit on the crank pin. And then you can just set this here. And then what you'll do is you'll get your little IAME tool, slide it over the pin, and then you can move it over and the pin will actually fall into the hole a little bit for you right there. See, it's not seated in, but the pin has fallen in just enough to where this doesn't move. And you can just feel it with your fingers. You'll know when you've got it in there. Just like that. Go ahead and get this box out of the way. And then don't just drop this down. You know, lower it slowly. Just like that. Get this up underneath the press. And then the same tool I used to push the pin out, I'll set right here just to take up some of the travel so I'm not pumping the press quite as far. We can go ahead and get this first half of the can see that a little better. Okay, got the pin pressed into the first half. Just like that. Let's go ahead and put this back in. All right, so we've got to get the washer. So again, I just use a little bit of castor oil. Get that coated pretty good. Put the first washer on. And now it's time for the bearing. So I'm just going to use the same bearing that I put the tape on. So all I do is just slide it over the crank, and then I can remove the tape. Just like that. Bearing on. Alright. Then the next thing we'll do is we'll get our rod. And if you remember from before, we want to make sure we get this orientated correctly. So here, this is the ignition side of the web, of the crank, excuse me. So I'm going to make sure that when I pulled it off, I had the IAME logo pointed that way. So I'm just going to make sure I get it back on the same way. We'll go ahead and get our other washer. A little bit of oil. And you know what? I forgot to put oil on the bearing. Let's pull this rod off. Put a little bit of oil on your bearing. And then put the rod on. And then we can get on the other thrust washer. Grab the other half of our crank. Get that in there. And then you just slide the jig back together, and you make sure that the pin lines up to the other side of the web. Just like that. And the way I like to make sure that I've got it lined up is if I spin this side of the web, the other side spins with it. So I know I've got this lined up where it needs to be. So after you've got that in there, you can go ahead and tip this guy back up. There's our crank in the jig. So from here, all we got to do is press it back together. So this is the part right here, guys, that you'll just need to get a feel for, because depending on how much pressure you put on this is going to determine how true it comes out and how much work we're going to have to put into it once we get it on the truing stand. And with my other press, I had a pretty good feel for it. So with this new press, I'm still kind of trying to get my feeling for exactly where I need to be. I think that's probably pretty good right there. You know what, we'll try that. There's our rebuilt crank. What it feels like we need to go a little bit more. So this right here, there's a little gap right here, and I'd have to go look at the rebuild guide, but I think I'd have to go look at it. But there's really not much you can do. I mean, obviously once you get it completely pressed, there's not going to be much you can do to adjust it, unless for some reason you didn't have it all the way pressed in. Then I guess that measurement might change on you. But I'm actually going to throw this back in here. See if we can press it just a little bit more. Like I said, I'm still trying to get a feel for this new press. Felt like there was a slight gap that I need to get pressed in. So let's press this again real quick. So according to the new pressure gauge that I have on my press, that's about 11 tons that I've got on there. Let's try that. Oh yeah, feels much better. So when I was rubbing my fingers across, it felt like there was still a little bit of a lip, so that the web wasn't pressed all the way on, but now it's flush. And that was with 11 tons, so I'm going to remember that when I'm doing this in the future. There it is, guys. So let's go ahead, let's put this on the truing stand and see how good of a job we did. Alright, let's get this in the truing stand and see what the results are. And you don't have to worry about what numbers you see to begin with. We're just going to want to see how much those numbers move, if any. And to do that, all you do is spin the crank around. So it looks like that's a low spot for this web. So it's definitely not perfect. We're going to need to do some banging on it. Yeah, so this web over here, it's quite a bit off. Okay, so I'm going to have to bang on this thing to get it trued up. And this is probably going to be the most difficult part for sure, because you kind of got to figure where am I going to need to bang on this web to get this trued up. So let's just focus on this side. So here's my starting point. And as I roll it forward, see, watch the number climb or fall. So it looks like that's the low spot right there, exactly opposite of the crank pin. So you kind of got to visualize it. So if that's the low spot, how are you going to need to bang on this thing so that that's not the low spot? Well, since it's directly opposite of the crank pin, I would need to push that web up. So I'm going to actually need to put a wedge in here so that I can push this web out a little bit. And to do that, where'd it go? There it is right there. I've got this little aluminum wedge that I can actually set in here and bang on that with that hammer to kind of help split the webs. So that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to try to do first, because that's definitely seems like my low spot right there. So I'm going to stick a wedge in here, bang on it, and then we'll measure it again and see if that changes anything. And just little bits, guys. I'm not going to want to just smash this in here in case I blow it way too far out, and then I'd have to put it in the vise to squish it back in.
There's one, guys. No lie, that was absolutely there. Let's really get there. Okay,
was doing down here. So I've got my vise, and what I'm doing is I'm just setting the crank on here. It's got this little anvil piece right here. Just got a towel on there just to try to keep the scratches off. And then I'm setting the web on the anvil, and then I'm banging on this other side over here to try to true that up. And I finally got it trued up, but I'm going to tell you right now, that was not fun. So if you guys wanted to see how a real crank gets rebuilt, there you go. Okay guys, so the crank is rebuilt. So to be honest with you, I was hoping that I would be able to do this video, put the crank in the jig over there, press it, pull it out, put it on the truing stand, and have it just come out perfect like I'm some sort of professional. But as you can see, definitely not the case. That crank did take some work to get trued up. So essentially what was happening is I was getting a low spot right here, exactly opposite of the crank pin. So I was trying to split it with my wedge, and then after I would split it with the wedge, the high spot would move, and you see the crank pin right here, and my high spot was over here on this side. So I was banging on this crank web right here to get that trued out, and I had to go back and forth, God, 3, 4, 5 times before I could finally get it trued up. But I did end up getting it trued up, essentially within 1/100 of a millimeter. This side was perfect. It was just this one web that was off. but I did get it trued up after a little bit of love. So I apologize that the video was kind of rough. I did not expect to have to work on it that much. But that's the reality, guys. Sometimes things just don't work out the way you want them to. But definitely with a little bit of time and a copper hammer, you can definitely get it trued up. And you know, you could probably run it with it not being true, but I hear that can put some stress on the case bearings, and it can hurt acceleration. So you want to make sure that this thing is as true as you can possibly get it. Especially if you're working on a customer's engine, there's no way you can just send them back an engine and the crank's not true. So just keep at it. You'll eventually get it. So you just seen me struggle with it. So alright guys, we pretty much got all the difficult stuff out of the way. So the next video, we're just going to be slapping things back together. We'll do a leak up test on it, a compression test on it, just to make sure it's ready to go. But yeah, essentially all the hard work's out of the way. So as always, appreciate you for tuning in. Plan your race, race your plan. Have a good time at the track.